Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. A while back we started a series called 10 Flaws. Now a lot of you guys out there complained that I only covered the quote-unquote bad factions in Star Wars. Our 10 Flaws series covered the Death Star, Star Destroyers, Stormtroopers, TIE Fighters, and the B-1 Battle Droid. And you know what guys, you are right. We should be covering the so-called good guys in the Star Wars universe as well.
Great shot!
So today we'll be looking at the little-known Rebel Alliance Infantry. And yes, they are little known, because if you really think about it, in the original trilogy, we only see Rebel Infantry on the ground during the Battle of Endor. And those guys were technically Alliance Special Forces anyway. It wasn't until Rogue One that we finally saw some true Rebel Infantry, and even then never in large deployments. As a matter of fact, most of the time in the movies we only see the Alliance Navy. Why is that? Well, it's because the Rebel Alliance Navy, while small, was well equipped, well funded, and arguably had better snub fighters than the Empire did. And the original trilogy was, for all intents and purposes, created post-Galactic Civil War as a series of propaganda films for the fledgling New Republic. With the Empire defeated and the New Republic struggling to fill its vacuum, they released movies like this to remind the populace of how much the rebellion had sacrificed to win them their freedom in the first place. The films were actually written and produced by a well-known Luke the Butcher of Yavin 4 Skywalker apologist. He purposely left the Rebel Infantry out of his movies because before the Battle of Endor, Rebel ground forces failed to win even one large set-piece ground battle against the Empire. The importance of the mid-rim offensive after Yavin 4 is completely overblown. After they managed to surprise a few Imperial garrisons, they quickly lost all of that ground in what was known as the mid-rim retreat. In reality, only a few small Rebel companies were able to actually stand in a firefight against even a regular Imperial Army unit, let alone in an elite Stormtrooper company. And we'll explain to you guys why in this video when we break down the 10 major flaws with the Rebel Infantry. The Rebel Army was not a professional organization, and it wasn't structured like a professional army either. There is very little oversight. Deployed units would have limited communications from Central Rebel Command, and most command decisions were made at the company level. It wasn't all that different from the Rebel Alliance's earlier days when they were just a bunch of different Rebel cells loosely associated with each other. This decentralized structure meant that the Rebel companies were highly independent, and when Rebel Central Command was compromised, like they were during the Battle of Yavin 4 and Hoth, the rest of the rebellion would still be able to function. But overall, it made it very hard for the rebellion to coordinate large-scale battles, which is why they really didn't win any large-scale battles until after the Battle of Endor. Without a better unified command structure, the few rebel victories on the ground were usually carried out by small units or special forces against smaller Imperial targets. Unit quality and loyalty varied from company to company. The Imperial Navy generally had better educated and individualistic recruits. They also had more mobility and access to starships, which is why several pilots and officers defected to the Rebel Navy. It was much rarer for members of the Imperial Army, and especially the fanatic Stormtrooper Corps, to defect to the Rebel Army. So rebellion ground forces weren't made up of career soldiers, but teachers, politicians, mechanics, and really a random assortment of individuals. It wasn't until you got higher into the command structure that you had actual former soldiers, whether it be former Imperials like Crix Medine or even older veterans from the Clone Wars. So even at the company level, the leadership really varied depending on which unit you were in. You had units like the 61st Mobile Infantry, which was led by Captain Hal, who was a former teacher. He believed in fighting for a higher moral ground and trained his soldiers to limit civilian casualties and collateral damage. While this meant higher casualties for his own forces, this also attracted more new recruits and generally gave the rebellion a good name. Hal understood that the rebellion could never completely destroy the Empire through a conventional war. They were simply too large and well equipped. Instead, the rebellion needed to inspire more people to join their ranks and eventually overthrow the Empire. It was all about the hearts and minds. But for every Hal, you also had a Saw Gerrera who was focused on inflicting as much damage on the Empire, even if it meant killing non-combatants. Even though Saw's partisans eventually were forced out of the rebellion, many other rebel units were still known for using similar tactics. But since the New Republic won the war, it will remain forever unknown how many war crimes were actually committed by rebel troops. A lot of the behavioral problems and war crimes committed by rebel troops was the result of very relaxed recruiting standards. During the mid-rim offensive and retreat, most rebel infantry companies suffered massive casualties and were forced to recruit from the local civilian populace. There were no official rebellion recruiters to give people medical checks, background checks, and interviews. There weren't even any reserves to send to the front lines. A depleted Rebel infantry unit would set up a recruiting area, because there's always the chance that an Imperial loyalist might run into the middle of a Rebel camp, go all Admiral Akbar with a suicide vest, and kill a lot of people. The recruiting was actually done by NCOs or squad leaders who walked around and chose the people they wanted on their team. I'm pretty sure that's how Trader Joe's also hires. And oftentimes these recruits were murderers, thieves, or individuals just looking for a ride off the planet that the rebellion had just destroyed. And it was quite difficult for the rebellion to root out Imperial spies amongst the recruits' ranks. Now, as you might have suspected, because there's no official recruiting process, there's also no real official training process either, especially for units that were in the field. Again, training was up to your squad leader or NCO. And not only did some recruits not have any combat experience, some were from completely primitive worlds that didn't even have basic things like electricity or toilets, so you also had a cultural and technological barrier to overcome. And again, that's why someone like Captain Hal, who was a teacher, made such a good Rebel commander, because his company was a training company as well as a combat company. Now, some special Rebel units did receive extra training at Rebel Central Command, but most general infantry units were trained whenever or wherever Rebel company had a moment to rest. In theory, the standard Rebel infantry weapon was the Blastech A280. In reality, the Rebels used whatever they could get their hands on, whether that was a captured Imperial E-11, a clone-era DC-15, or even an old-school slug-thrower marksman rifle. Most regular Rebel infantry also didn't wear any armor, as the Rebellion didn't issue any. Even most Rebellion Special Forces went into battle with just basic fatigues. That's not to say that the Rebel soldiers didn't pick up Stormtrooper armor or pieces of Durasteel and strap it onto their chest. Another problem was that most units didn't even have standard unit patches, let alone uniforms, making it extremely difficult for the Rebel units to identify each other. This basically made your average Rebel soldier an unlawful combatant in the eyes of Imperial law, which means they had no rights when they were captured. But the lack of standardization wasn't just because of the Rebellion's lack of resources. They are actually better funded than most people knew. The bigger problem was their utter lack of logistic support. In reality, only Headquarter and Central Command units had standardized equipment on par with the professional army. Your average Rebel infantry company at best looked like a bunch of mercenaries, and at worst looked like a bunch of bandits, and also acted like bandits. Unlike the Empire, the Rebellion didn't have a human-only policy for recruitment. They were desperate for manpower after all. This meant supplying armor and uniforms, and even weapons was extremely difficult. A Twi'lek needs a different type of helmet from a Zabrak. A jacket that would fit on a human definitely won't fit on a Basilisk. And I'm pretty sure if you try to put pants on a Hutt or a Wookiee, they'll try to kill you. So it was a mess right from the get-go. And even if the Rebellion could create a supply chain that could equip all of these oddly shaped aliens, the Rebel Navy lacked the ships to supply everyone. That's why most Rebel infantry units functioned as small, self-sustaining armies. The 61st Mobile Infantry was stationed out of a CR-90 Corvette and had only one gunship to support them. They really couldn't depend on Rebel Central Command for anything, so they had to scrounge for their own food, medical supplies, ammunition, and even vehicles. This, at the best of times, put a strain on relations between the Rebel soldiers and local populaces. Any prolonged stay in any area could not be sustained without some light pillaging and raiding. And Rebel units oftentimes lacked standardized ground vehicles as well, and usually stole and repurposed whatever civilian vehicles they could find. Because most of these units lacked reliable vehicles, they weren't mobile as they needed to be. One of the major reasons why the Rebellion couldn't really win major ground battles was because of their lack of naval support. The Rebel Navy in the earlier days of the war had at best a few hundred ships compared to the Galactic Navy's several hundreds of thousands of ships. And in Star Wars, he who controls orbit controls the ground battle as well. Because once orbital bombardment begins, the battle on the ground is over. And most of these Rebel infantry companies had at best a few X-Wings or maybe a gunship protecting their space assets, which meant as soon as a Star Destroyer came to the system, they had to hightail it out of there. This limited most Rebel infantry units to hit and run tactics. Not only did the Rebellion lack naval support, they also had a lack of heavy weaponry on the ground as well. Perhaps the most effective weapon emplacement the Rebels had were just ion cannons, which could disable a Star Destroyer temporarily. But besides that, they had very little firepower underneath their command. Echo Base at the time was supposed to be one of the most heavily guarded Rebel positions, and it didn't even have any weapons capable of stopping an AT-AT. This problem was even worse for Rebel infantry not fighting from a prepared fixed position. Aside from a shoulder-launched anti-tank weapon, the Rebels had no way of really combating anything larger than an AT-ST. Lastly, the rebellion was a volunteer force. Rebel commanders knew that most of the time they were sending their soldiers to certain death against much better equipped and trained forces. Morale usually wasn't great. Combine that with terrible logistics and a high casualty rate along with very little pay, and you had a lot of people deserting. Sometimes entire battalions would just fade away after a battle. And the rebellion didn't have the resources to go after the people who went AWOL. At the end of the day, the Alliance didn't win the war because of the Rebel Infantry. The Alliance won the war despite the Rebel Infantry. Captain Howell was right. This battle was purely ideological. The rebellion just needed to survive and occasionally win a victory so that more civilians would join the cause. The Rebel Infantry had its purposes, but for the most part, they were getting slaughtered by stormtroopers or slaughtering civilians themselves to steal their belongings. That's why after the Galactic Civil War, most of the veterans that were highlighted by popular media were usually pilots from the Rebel Navy, not the Rebel Army. So guys, those are our 10 flaws for the Rebel Infantry. As you can see, there's a reason why we don't see a lot of these guys in the movies. They just weren't really that good at their jobs. Of course, there's like Rogue One, and then you had your 61st Mobile Infantry, but most of the time they were just cannon fodder, let's be honest. So guys, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button, and don't forget to check out the rest of our 10 Flaws series. We've done a bunch of these videos, and we're going to continue on doing them. Well guys, thanks for joining us today. As usual, if you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.